everyone, we've got a great interview for you this week on the Europeans. Timothy Garton Ash, one of Britain's best writers on Europe, a professor of modern European history at the University of Oxford, and one of those rare British people that publicly and proudly identifies themselves as a European. This is a big, sweeping conversation about Europe's past and its present and its future at a time of huge, huge change in international politics. And we hope that you enjoy it as much as we did. Timothy, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a long time since we spoke. I think we last had you on the show in 2021, and a lot has changed. So it feels like a very good time to check in.
Great to be with you again.
So
everything has changed since 2021. Everything.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And I guess I wanted to start with your wonderful book, Homelands. You've witnessed a lot of change on this continent since moving to what was, at the time, a divided Berlin as a young man. Does it feel to you, as a historian who takes a pretty long view of Europe, like we are currently living through something that feels like a turning point? Or does this feel like a gap between turning points or something else?
No question. It's a huge turning point. But it's not just since Trump came to power. The turning point begins on the 24th of February with 2022, with Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As I argue in the book, and the book ends basically with the beginning of the big war in Ukraine. And what I say there is these two big overlapping periods of European history, the post-war period since 1945 and what I call the post-wall period, the period since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, ended together, crash bang, at a stroke. And so we're at the beginning of something new, and I think the three or four biggest dimensions of it are: one, attack from the east, Vladimir Putin, more than 3 years of the largest war in Europe since 1945. Two, the revelation that there's a whole world out there which is quite happy to do business with Russia, even while it's waging a neo-colonial war against Ukraine. China, India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, all fine going on doing business with Russia. That's a shock. Third, the attack from within. I mean, the populist pressures in Europe since we last spoke have, grown. I mean, think just about the amazing, shocking success of the AfD in Germany. And then the cruelest blow of all, we're under attack from the West, from Washington. And if you put together those four things, attack from the East, discovery we're in a post-Western world, the assault from below, and now the attack from the West, this is clearly a formative moment.
So, yeah, this clearly feels like a turning point. But I wanted to go back and ask you if all these turning points in history have always been obvious that they were historic at the time. So if you look back at your life and your career, has it always been clear how crucial these turning points were to you at the time? Or when you look back, are some points more or less significant than they seemed at the time?
Really interesting question. Events are like buildings. They look bigger close to. And so the tendency is often to overestimate the importance of events, which turn out actually to be less historic in their consequences. The biggest example for me is 9/11. I mean, at the time, everybody said this is a turning point in world history. It changes everything. Well, it changed a lot in the Middle East. It changed a lot in the United States. But I would argue it wasn't the big turning point for us in Europe. So, there were sometimes turning points that you don't notice, but they're there. But more often, there are things that look like big turning points, which turned out not to have been.
Or ones that turn out to be turning points for parts of the world and not others, perhaps, as well.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And there's always, listen, you have a podcast. We have such a kind of fiercely competitive information environment where everyone is competing for attention. So there's always a tendency to hyperbole. right? I mean, we're just experiencing one as we speak. Pope Francis dies. And, every hour there are correspondents online saying this is the biggest thing to happen in the Catholic Church since the last biggest thing. Well, maybe it will be a turning point for the Catholic Church, or maybe it won't. Maybe actually it'll be a story of continuity. But I've no doubt, having said that, I've no doubt, just as we knew 2 hours later that the fall of the Berlin Wall was a great historic turning point, and we knew that immediately. That's why I get on the plane to Berlin the next morning, like many other people. 2022, we know it is a big turning point. There's no mistake about that. And Trump's assault on Europe is another one.
Your new book is about Europe, your personal experience of Europe. You spent your life thinking about Europe, living and breathing Europe. There is a chapter in your book called Europes, with an S on the end, Europes plural. It's mainly about the different ideas there are about what Europe is. Is it okay if some of us are talking about different things when we talk about Europe?
Well, I mean, I think that is, first of all, it's absolutely true that there's no other continent which has such different meanings. I mean, what is Europe? It's a geographical expression. It's a shared historical experience. It's a set of ideas and images and ideals. And it's a political project, the European Union. That's 4 big things, all of which are very different. Africa or Asia or Australasia, none of them have that same complexity about it. The question is, do our Europes, the Europes we have as hundreds of millions of Europeans, have enough in common to make it a shared project going forward, right? So what we don't have to have is a shared past, because we have incredibly different pasts. But what we have to have is some sense that we want to have a shared future.
You also talk about this existential uncertainty that so many European countries have about whether or not they are European or belong in Europe. Do you think that uncertainty or that struggle is a fundamentally destabilizing force for the European project? Or could you argue that it keeps us all on our toes, and especially the European institutions?
Dominic, I think spot on. I think that's exactly it. There's a kind of cliche. People say only in England and Russia do people say I'm going to Europe when they're crossing to the continent. It's totally untrue. People in Scandinavia, people in Greece say that all the time. And, I'm really struck in Ukraine. I don't know if either of you have been to Ukraine recently, but it's, young Ukrainians who are absolutely passionate about Ukraine being part of Europe, part of the European Union, still habitually say, oh, I'm going to Europe tomorrow. Mm. So those senses coexist. And that goes back to these 4 dimensions, right? Because it's perfectly credible to think that, you're not in Europe, you're not in the European Union, but you have a strong idea of shared values and a shared future. The problem comes if we don't have a strong enough sense of shared future. The great French historian Ernest Renan famously said that a nation is a plébiscite de tous les jours, a plebiscite on every day. And in a way, Europe is a referendum on every day, right? If not enough Europeans think we want to hang together, then we'll go back to hanging separately.
Do you think we currently have enough of a shared vision of the future?
So this is such a great question. And listen, what I would say is that I can't think of another period, certainly in my lifetime, so my 50 years plus of European experience, where the forces of integration and disintegration have been so finely balanced. So on the one hand, there's clearly, the European Union has made great advances also through COVID, also through the war in Ukraine. There are great projects out there, digital single market, deeper capital markets, shared defense. But on the other hand, the forces of disintegration have never been so powerful. You've never had a nationalist member state like Hungary frontally assaulting everything the European Union stands for. You've never had a hard right populist nationalist party in Germany getting close to a quarter of the votes. Not to mention Rassemblement National in France and all the other populist nationalist forces. So I think that's exactly the way to think about this period that begins in 2022. At some point, I will write a sequel to Homelands, and it will be about this. It's not a turning point because it's a pivotal period. It's about this period that starts in 2022, but at some point it'll settle down into a new pattern. But the new pattern could be a more united Europe, as I hope, but it could also be a more disintegrated Europe.
It's all to play for, and it's shifting. And actually, talking about shifting, in the book, you try and come up with a good metaphor for Europe. And what you come up with is some kind of combination of a tapestry and a kaleidoscope. Why did you settle on that as the best metaphor for this continent?
Yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on that. And by the way, all these translators of the book into all these different languages had great fun trying to find a term for kaleido-tapestry. So it's like a kaleidoscope in the sense that the same coloured fragments and pieces are constantly being rearranged, right? Through time and through space. But it's like a tapestry in that there's still some sort of shared larger composition. You go to a European city, there's a town hall, there are churches, there's a marketplace, there are cafes, there's maybe a university, there's some housing estates. They're composed in different ways, but it's, you're in a European city. It's just another version of the European tapestry. And the same is true of our countries, so that the whole continent is this vast, fascinating, constantly moving and changing and shifting tapestry.
I really like it as an image, although I was secretly hoping you would. I remember last time you were on the show, you mentioned turning cacophony into polyphony, and you were going for more musical imagery. And as a musician myself, I was hoping you were going to stick with the polyphonic metaphor.
Yeah,
the visual people will like this one.
Yeah, Dominic, I love polyphony. Maybe you can give us an example of it, but that's sort of the ideal.
Yeah.
Right. That's the goal. The reality is this incredibly complicated thing, which is part cacophony and part not. But Europe at best is polyphony.
Yeah, very true. Well, during your career, you've met a lot of very powerful and important people, a lot of the decision makers in the world. And I found it really interesting to read about your visit to the White House to advise George W. Bush just before his first visit to the European Union. I think you encouraged Bush to see NATO expansion, including Baltic countries, as a good idea, among some other things. But anyway, I couldn't help fantasizing about what advice you would give Donald Trump today, what argument you would most like to put to him if you were summoned to the White House again in 2025. Any ideas?
I'm tempted to say resign. Because I think he would be impervious to the advice. I mean, at the time we thought George W. Bush was a really dangerous guy, and he did mark a shift. But he's still, by the way, advised by Condi Rice, who was my colleague at Stanford, which is how I got invited. He did invite 5 of us to sit down with him for 2.5 hours before his first official visit to Europe and first meeting with Putin, and really talk through, what the goals would be. Whereas Trump hates the EU, right? He said it was set up to screw us. So he wouldn't be asking for our advice in the first place. And he'd be looking to other Europeans. And this is the other thing. He may have a group of people sitting with him in the Oval Office, but it would be Viktor Orban and Giorgia Meloni and a couple of, national conservative, anti-liberal intellectuals. And what's so dangerous for us is it's not just Trump's US against Europe, it's Trump's US supporting one Europe against the other. Because there's always been, people forget this, particularly in Brussels, there's always been the other Europe, the reactionary, Christian nationalist, anti-liberal, xenophobic Europe represented by Viktor Orban. And now it's got the most powerful supporter in the world.
So we are clearly living through a very vulnerable moment for this continent, and Trump obviously plays a huge role in that. But do you see any potential for any good to come out of Trumpism for Europe?
Yeah, a lot. Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust says, I represent the force that always tries to do bad and ends up doing good. And, the best case scenario is that it's Mephistophelian in its effect. I mean, by the way, it's really interesting because obviously, I have a lot of wonderful liberal American friends, people like Tim Snyder, Ann Applebaum, my colleagues at Stanford, Mike McFaul, and so on. It's really bad for them because there's no upside in Trump for the United States, right? But there's a big potential upside in Trump for us, which is the combination of Putin, post-Western world populism, and now Trump, finally makes us not just wake up but get out of bed and do something. It finally galvanizes us. And you know what? I have good days and bad days on this. On good days, I think, finally, challenge and response. European leaders have got it, including, by the way, British leaders. They're going to do something about it. On bad days, when I see the same old sort of petty national egotism and the democratic national games going on, I think even this is not going to make us get our act together.
Yeah, well, I have good days and bad days too, and I think lots of listeners will be able to see themselves in that. But let's move on. But
it's up to us. But listen, it's up to us. I mean, that we can sit here and say good days and bad days, but it is actually, it's not just up to those people up there and the people in Brussels. It is actually up to us to mobilize.
Yeah. Well, let's see what we can do, or at least let's talk about some politicians that are a bit more inspiring than the man in the White House right now. I wanted to ask you a few quick fire questions about European politicians. I've just got three. The idea is that you just tell me the first names that pop into your head when I ask you the following questions. So first, I wanted to ask, who do you think is the politician who has best understood and harnessed the power of European cooperation? Can be anyone in European history. In
European history?
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't have to be a current
Doesn't have
leader,
to be
right?
today.
Is that part of the
I
game?
see.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Spontaneously, I would say Jean Monnet. I mean, it's amazing that, you go back through European history, there are all these endless schemes for European unity. But this guy who was a cognac manufacturer, right? He just got it. And there's lots wrong with the method, but actually they're very, he's the one whose method was then realized. So I think he understood it, better than most people, and actually that whole, generation of European leaders more broadly.
Which politician that you have met have you been most impressed by?
Oh, that's easy. Václav Havel.
Oh, yeah.
He's in many ways the hero of homelands. But in a way, that's because he wasn't a politician. He certainly wasn't your common or garden politician. He was a writer, an essayist, a playwright, an incredibly brave dissident, the director of the Velvet Revolution, which I was incredibly lucky to witness at first hand, but then, a president, which is something slightly different from a politician. But he's the one, no question. And by the way, he's the one whose legacy still endures more than anyone else from 1989, right? You can't think of another figure, even Gorbachev, but particularly Gorbachev, but any other figure from '89 who has such a lasting imprint, who's still a reference point.
In what ways do you think that legacy survives?
Well, in thinking about the importance of human rights, of being consistent in standing up for human rights, when we look at the sort of crass inconsistency between what many European leaders have been saying about violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine and what they've been saying or not saying about Gaza, which is really shocking, in my view. I mean, it goes without saying 7th of October was a horrendous atrocity and Israel had a right to defend itself, but there's no question there have been massive violations of international humanitarian law. And Havel is the voice from the recent past who says, if you're Europe, you have to be consistent. You have to stand up against violations of human rights wherever they occur, including if they're done by China. Remember, he was a great friend and admirer of the Dalai Lama. So that would be one element of it. Another thing which I quote in the book, which is really important, he says, the European project has to have a heart as well as a head. And he says reading the Maastricht Treaty was something like reading some sort of complicated manual for some machine tool, that it didn't speak to the heart at all. So definitely, Havel lives.
Great, that one's clear. Not quite as quick fire as I was imagining it, but it's a very interesting.
Oh, sorry.
I'm banging on. I don't mind at all. Who cares about quick fire questions? Anyway, my final one is: who is leading Europe today?
There's an easy answer to that: nobody, because it never has been one person, and when it was, Napoleon, Hitler, that was bad news for Europe. So it's always going to be a coalition of people. But I think there are some really impressive leaders, and I can give you quickfire, 3. All of them women, and I think this is significant. Kaja Kallas, Mette Frederiksen, Ursula von der Leyen.
Great.
The women are getting stuff done. Let's stick with what's happening today in Europe. Last time we spoke to you, back in February 2021, we talked about ways in which the EU could use its influence to persuade these neo-authoritarian governments in Poland and Hungary not to destroy their respective democracies. Since then, the populists of the Law and Justice Party have lost power in Poland, and in Hungary, which I think you have previously described as no longer a democracy, it's looking like there is at least a chance that Orban could lose next year's election. Do you think that the changes that have been happening in public opinion in Hungary and Poland, can give us a kind of a blueprint for how to fight back against the far right and against the decay of the democracies that we've managed to build on this continent?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the United States should be taking Polish lessons. That is the one big pushback success story. Tragically, no thanks to the EU.
That was going to be my next question.
And that's a shocker. That's a shocker. I say shocker. We've all got sort of sadly used to it by now. How limited is the so-called normative power of the EU? So it was the Poles who restored a much degraded democracy in Poland, but there are very important lessons there. If the biggest independent TV station, TVN, had been taken over by the populists, which they tried very hard to do, and the only people who stopped them were the United States because it was a US owner, I think the election in October 2023 could have gone the other way, and the populists would still be in power. So the information space and key media is just crucial. And this is what makes it so difficult in Hungary, because, as you know, Orban has got the information space very kind of cleverly under control through friendly media owners. So it's not just it's not an obvious monopoly, but actually he controls it. Second lesson, How did the Poles turn it around? Huge mobilization, both on the ground and online, great use of social media. More people turn out to vote than ever before in Polish history, more women than men, more young voters than old. There's a lesson for us.
There are also, though, presumably a lot of lessons about how hard it is to rebuild a democracy after it's been unpicked in Poland.
Exactly right. And, how do you restore the rule of law if the institution at the pinnacle of the rule of law, namely the Constitutional Court, has itself been deeply politicized and corrupted? Can you then restore the rule of law by legal means? These are very, very difficult challenges which Poland is wrestling with. And I think in the Hungarian case, even if, as I hope, Peter Magyar wins the next election, leading this big opposition party, TISA, wins the next election in 2026, it'll be even more of a struggle in Hungary. So no, you're dead right. I mean, there are positive lessons, but there are also lessons about how difficult it is.
So you said the EU should not take any credit to what's happened in Poland, but what more do you think the EU should be doing to deal with Viktor Orban in Hungary and the other growing far-right parties across Europe?
Let me take Orban, because that's actually a member state which is consistently and flagrantly violating the values laid out in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, as well as a whole other slew of things, and also blocking an otherwise common European position in support of Ukraine against outrageous Russian aggression. The money. That is the one key lever. They do not deserve to get those billions of EU funds which have actually entrenched Orban, stabilized, consolidated Orban's electoral authoritarian regime, behaving as they are at the moment. And the one respect in which the EU slightly helped in the Polish election was in withholding the money, because Donald Tusk was able to say, we'll unlock the European money. So that's the key thing. Nothing else matters as much as that.
But there has been money withheld from Hungary already. We haven't seen much change yet. Is it just a question of doing it more, doing it harder?
Yeah. More, harder, longer. So as you know, what happened is there was a significant amount of money withheld. It was beginning to bite, and then we get the full-scale war in Ukraine. And because you need unanimity on many of these votes on Ukraine, on sanctions and so on, Orban, who I think could rightly be described as the EU's blackmailer in chief, is effectively able to blackmail the rest of the EU to release some of the money. That's the key reason why it's not been, as effective as it might otherwise have been. And it's a genuine problem with the sort of basic functioning of the EU, that we're very good at setting standards for candidate countries, but not at protecting our own values inside our own member states.
Mm-hmm. We're coming towards the end of our conversation, Timothy. A last question from me, I guess, and I want to take the kind of long view of history again. There's a moment in your book where you note how out of date Tintin seems when you read it these days, when it comes to attitudes towards European colonies in Africa. Are there elements of your own thinking on Europe that have changed with the times, or things that you think now that you think probably will still change as time goes on?
No question. I mean, I hope it's not as bad as Tintin in the Congo, which is...
If you haven't read it, it's quite an eye-opener, listeners.
Yeah, it sure is. My goodness, you can actually still get it. Although I have to confess, I absolutely love Tintin, as did my kids. I mean, it's wonderful. Anyway, and, no question about it. I mean, I think if I got in a time machine, went back 50 years, the Oxford I was at 50 years ago, where most of the colleges were all male, still, for example. Women were not admitted to most Oxford colleges. And it was very class divided between people who've been to private schools and state schools and so on. So, I mean, and I think I look back at myself and think, God, he was a frightful snob. So, yes, definitely things have changed there. But I would say the sort of one of the most important ones is that as a lifelong liberal, a real liberal, and because my formative experiences were in Eastern Europe, I really went along with economic liberalism, right? Because if you'd come out of a planned economy, a command economy, economic freedom is really important. And it's now absolutely clear that the excesses of neoliberalism, the massive inequalities that it's created, the plutocracy, the oligarchy it's created, is one of the biggest threats to liberalism today. So if I was sort of revisiting a political attitude, I would be very much less relaxed about, the way free market economics were going.
And for my final question, I'd like to look forward to the future and talk about some maybe predictions, which I see you write in your book is a mixture. To predict is to mix folly and wisdom, but I think we should try anyway and see if we can get that healthy mix. And I wanted to ask you specifically about what you think might come out of the huge wave of protests that we see across Europe at the moment. I mean, particularly in Georgia, in Serbia, but also most recently in Turkey following the arrest of Mayor of Istanbul. Do you think this huge show of discontent that we're seeing in the streets is going to lead to change in Europe? Do you think these protests are going to have impact on Europe's path ahead?
Just as there was nothing inevitable about the triumph of liberalism, so there's nothing inevitable about the triumph of populism or nationalism. When people have seen the disadvantages for long enough, 16 years in Hungary, much longer than that in Turkey, they start wanting something else. So there's a kind of a wave pattern in this, or a pendulum effect, isn't there? But these are quite long-term effects. So while I think the protests have been really, truly magnificent in Belarus, for example, amazing example of civil resistance. In Georgia, very brave. In Turkey, I'm not sure we're necessarily going to see any short-term good effects, also because, unfortunately, Europe has become much more transactional. And we're making deals with Turkey over migration. We're making deals with Turkey because of the war in Ukraine. We're going to make deals with Turkey because of, our economic needs and human rights, and the democratic opposition have slid right down the scale of priorities. So I think short term we have to be very realistic in our expectations. But in the long run, I've absolutely no doubt that the pendulum will swing back towards more freedom in many of these countries, because it fundamentally speaks to what people want.
Well, that feels like a very hopeful place to end things. And I'm looking forward to reading the next book about how 22 was the start of a transition period towards something much better. Although, yeah, I also have these bad days where sometimes that feels very far away.
Yeah.
Might be a long transition.
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, if you look at it, these periods don't last forever, right? And it's already been going on 3 years. So I would think, by the end of the decade, we probably have a much clearer idea of which way things are going. and let's make sure it's a good one.
Well, we look forward to having you back on the show in a few years' time, and hopefully it'll be a much brighter conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Timothy. And yeah, remember, listeners, the book is now out in 24 languages. Go read it, Homelands. It's a great read.
Great to be with you.